We're back in chapter 4, video number 19, talking about comparing strings and specifically looking at the try-parse method. So another example that we just talked in the previous video was how to convert or check to see what the user's input. And really all we're doing is we're using an if statement to see if the user typed in the correct type of data. So for example, if somebody types in, let's say the number TEN, TEN is definitely not a number. It's a string of characters. So if they typed in TEN, what we'd be doing is we'd be looking at that input of TEN and can we output it into a double variable type. So we're going to try to parse it into that, but it will fail at doing that. So this would come back and say, no, they didn't type the right thing in. And as soon as we know that information, we can direct the programs and the user to do the correct action. So that's why this is such a powerful feature, is that you're checking user input for exceptions. So you're taking the exception handling concept a lot further by looking at individual inputs. Where in the previous example, in the previous try catch, it's just saying, well, did they make some error at some point, which is a very broad stroke. All right, same with the decimal, the same idea that we just looked at. All right, so here is an example of using the concept for validating data. Really what we're talking about here is whatever data they type in should conform to a certain scope or certain range. So invalid data is going to cause you what they call GAGO. Garbage in is garbage out. So we want to help the user type in data that's within a certain scope. You see this all the time when people are typing in their email addresses and they forgot to put in, let's say, a ampersand sign. The computer will kick back and say that doesn't look like a valid email address. So in this example, when people are typing in something like the hours, they have to be within 168 hours. It has to be it has to be greater than 0, and it has to be less than or equal to 168 hours. Otherwise, do something else. So again, this is an example of where we could input some data and then test it in a variable, and then we could test that data to see if it's within the scope, within the range. And if it's not, well, then we can kick it back and say, you need to change your answer. Let's say they typed in 0. Well, you can't calculate 0 hours for working. You didn't work. You didn't get any pay, for example. Or if you type more than 168 hours, well, that would be impossible, let's say. There's not that many hours within the pay cycle, maybe. Here's another example. If you have a test score, if you guys are writing a test, is it possible to have a test if they ask you what you scored on a test more than 100%? You can't get more than 100%. Normally, unless people give bonus questions, but that might be an odd case. So if they can't get 0 though, so the test score could be greater than or equal to 0 if they got 0 on the test, or they could have less than or equal to 100% on a test score. It makes sense. And what we're doing here is we're testing to see the data that goes in conforms to the scope of information or the scope of the data that should be entered into there. For example, if I asked you right now, what should this be if you were talking about a person's age? If you're talking about entering a person's age, what would the expression be? Should you say the age is greater than and equal to 0? Is that even possible? Can someone actually be 0 age? No. So it would be just age is greater than 0. And age is less than, what's the maximum scope of age that you might want to put in? You might want to just leave it at 100 because anybody over 100, maybe we could lie. We could say, hey, you don't look a day over 100 years old. But you get my point. The idea there is that you want to put in some kind of range. You don't want someone typing in, I'm minus 10 years old, or I'm 5,000 years old. It just wouldn't make sense. All right, so in the next example, we'll actually start looking at how this will apply with our computer application.